There was a moment you probably don't even remember, not because it wasn't important, but because it was small. Someone laughed. Someone corrected you. Someone made you feel just slightly uncomfortable being yourself. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for you to notice that being fully yourself didn't feel completely safe. So you adjusted. You spoke a little differently. You held something back. You softened your opinion. You changed your tone. You became just a little easier to accept. And then it happened again. A different room, different people, same feeling. You adjusted again, and again, and again, until it stopped feeling like something you were doing and started feeling like who you were. Until one day, you weren't adjusting anymore. You were performing. And here's the part no one tells you. It didn't feel fake. It felt normal. The version of you people like is the version you created to be liked. And once that becomes your normal, you stop questioning it. You stop noticing it. You stop remembering what it felt like before. You start calling it your personality. You start believing this is just who you are. But it's not. It's who you learn to be in order to avoid rejection, in order to be accepted, in order to feel like you belong. Because at some point in your life, being fully yourself came with a cost. Maybe it was being judged. Maybe it was being ignored. Maybe it was just a look, a reaction, a subtle shift in how someone treated you. But your brain noticed, and your brain remembered, and your brain adapted. Because that's what it does. It protects you, and it studies what gets you accepted and what gets you rejected. And without asking your permission, it starts shaping you. It creates a version of you that fits into the room, a version that avoids conflict, a version that says the right things, a version that doesn't risk too much, a version that survives. But survival is not the same as being real, and that's why something always feels slightly off. Even when people like you, even when conversations go well, even when everything looks fine from the outside, there's a quiet feeling underneath all of it. Like you're not fully there, like something is missing, like no one really sees you. Because they don't. They see the version you show them, the version you built, the version that learned how to be accepted, not the version you hide. And over time, that gap gets bigger. The gap between who you are and who you present to the world. Until eventually, you don't even know where one ends and the other begins. You don't know what's real anymore. You don't know which thoughts are yours and which ones were shaped by fear. You don't know if people like you, or just the version of you you've been showing them. And that's where most people stay, not because they want to, but because they don't realize it's happening. They think this is just life. They think this is just maturity. They think this is just how people are. But it's not. It's adaptation. It's protection. It's a mask. And this video is about seeing that mask clearly for the first time. Not just understanding why you hide your true self, but recognizing how it started, how it shaped you, and why letting go of it feels so much harder than it should. Because the truth is, you don't hide your true self because you're fake. You hide it because at some point being yourself didn't feel safe. And until you understand that, you'll keep living a version of your life that was built to protect you, not to express who you really are. So the real question is not, who are you? The real question is, who would you be if you stopped trying to be accepted? Let's break the mask. Chapter 1. The first time you learn to hide yourself. There's a moment most people don't remember clearly, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't look important at the time. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of event you would tell as a story. It was small, almost invisible. But it was enough. Maybe it was in a classroom. You said something honestly. Not perfectly, not carefully, just honestly. And someone laughed. Not loudly. Not enough to stop the room. Just enough for your brain to notice. Just enough for your body to feel it. Just enough for something inside you to quietly register that moment, that feeling, that shift. And without thinking about it, you adjusted. Not completely, just slightly. You spoke a little differently next time. You held something back. You became a little more careful. And then it happened again. Different place, different people, same feeling. You adjusted again and again and again, until it stopped feeling like something you were doing and started feeling like who you were. Until one day, you weren't adjusting anymore, you were performing. And what makes this even more powerful is that you didn't choose it consciously. You didn't sit there and decide to hide yourself. You didn't tell yourself that you needed to change. Your brain made that decision for you. Quietly, automatically, without asking. Because your brain has one priority above everything else. Not happiness, not confidence, not authenticity, safety. And to your brain, rejection is not just uncomfortable. It feels dangerous. There is a reason for that. When you experience social rejection, your brain activates similar regions to physical pain, which means something very simple. Your brain doesn't treat rejection as just a social inconvenience. It treats it like something is wrong, like something needs to be corrected. So it corrects the easiest thing it can. You. The next time you speak, you hesitate. The next time you act, you think first. The next time you feel the urge to express something real, something unfiltered, something true, you soften it. You reshape it. You make it safer. Not for other people, for yourself. And here's where the pattern begins. You adjust yourself, even just a little, and people respond better. They nod, they smile, they accept you, and your brain immediately takes note. It connects the dots faster than you realize. Be this version, and you will be accepted. Be that version, and you will avoid discomfort. And just like that, a loop is created. You show less of your raw self. You get a better reaction. You repeat the behavior. Over time, this stops feeling like a strategy. It stops feeling like something you're doing. It starts feeling like you. That is how the mask is built. Not in one moment, but in a series of small, almost invisible adjustments that slowly shape your behavior, your reactions, your identity. And the reason it's so hard to see is because it works. It helps you fit in. It helps you avoid conflict. It helps you navigate social situations more smoothly. On the surface, it looks like growth. It looks like maturity. It even looks like confidence. But underneath it, something else is happening. You're learning that who you are, as you are, is not enough. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, repeated signal. So you keep adjusting. You become easier to talk to, easier to like, easier to accept, but also harder to truly know. Because every adjustment moves you slightly further away from what you actually think, from what you actually feel, from what you actually want to say. And the distance grows slowly, so slowly that you don't notice it. You laugh at things you don't find funny. You agree when you're not fully aligned. You stay quiet when something inside you wants to speak. Not because you're weak, not because you're fake, but because at some point that felt safer. And your brain remembers that, even years later, even in completely different environments, even with people who would actually accept you. The pattern doesn't disappear, it follows you. You walk into a room and before you even realize it, you are already adjusting. Your tone shifts, your posture changes, your words become more calculated, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to fit, enough to belong. And after a while, it becomes automatic. You don't think about it anymore. You don't question it. You start believing this is just your personality. This is just how you are. But it's not. It is who you learn to be. And there is a difference, a quiet but powerful difference. Because the person you learn to be was built around one goal: avoid rejection, not express truth. And the longer you live that way, the harder it becomes to separate the two. You don't know which reactions are real anymore. You don't know which thoughts are yours and which ones were shaped by fear. And that's when something deeper begins to happen. You don't just hide parts of yourself from other people. You start hiding them from yourself. You stop asking what you really think. You stop noticing what you really feel. You stop trusting your own instincts. Because everything has been filtered for so long that the filter feels real. And this is where most people get stuck. Not because they don't want to be themselves, but because they no longer know what that even means. Because the mask has been there for so long, it no longer feels like something you wear. It feels like identity, but the truth is simple. You didn't become someone else overnight. You just stopped being yourself one small moment at a time. And if that is how it was built, then that tells you something important. It can be undone. Not in one big decision, not in one dramatic shift, but in the same way it was created. Slowly, moment by moment. Because the first step is not becoming someone new. It is recognizing that the version of you you've been living as was never the full version of you to begin with. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. And that is where everything begins to change. Because now the question is no longer, how do I improve myself? The question becomes, where did I stop being myself? And once you start asking that question, you're already closer to the real version of you than you have been in a very long time. And that leads to something deeper. If your brain trained you to hide, then what exactly is it trying to protect you from? That is what we are going to explore next. Chapter 2. Why your brain forces you to hide. If you look at your behavior on the surface, it might feel confusing. Why would you hide parts of yourself when what you really want is to be seen? Why would you filter your thoughts when what you really want is to express them? Why would you hold yourself back when something inside you wants to move forward? It feels contradictory, but it isn't. Because the part of you that wants to be seen is not the same part of you that is trying to protect you. And most of the time, the part that protects you wins. Not because it is stronger, but because it feels more urgent. Because it feels like survival. Your brain is constantly scanning your environment, not for opportunities, but for threats. And one of the biggest threats it is designed to detect is social rejection. Not being accepted, not fitting in, being judged, being excluded. To your brain, these are not small things. They are signals. Signals that you might not belong. And for most of human history, not belonging had serious consequences. If you were pushed out of the group, you were alone. If you were alone, you were vulnerable. If you were vulnerable, you were in danger. So your brain evolved to prioritize one thing above almost everything else. Belonging, not truth, not self-expression. Belonging. And that priority is still running in the background of your mind today. Even if your environment has changed, even if you are safe, even if rejection no longer means physical danger, your brain doesn't update that easily. It still reacts the same way, which means when you feel even a small signal of rejection, your brain treats it seriously, and it starts looking for what caused it. And once it finds something, it starts making adjustments, not slowly, not carefully, quickly, efficiently, automatically. If speaking openly led to discomfort, it teaches you to speak more carefully. If showing emotion led to awkwardness, it teaches you to hide it. If being different led to judgment, it teaches you to blend in. And the more you repeat these adjustments, the stronger they become. Because your brain is built on patterns. It learns through repetition. It remembers what works. It avoids what doesn't. So when you adjust yourself and you get a better reaction, your brain locks that in. This works. Do it again, and you do, without thinking, without noticing, without questioning, until it becomes automatic, until it becomes instinct, until it becomes you. And this is where things start to get complicated, because the behavior that once protected you is now shaping your identity. You're no longer just reacting to situations. You are becoming a version of yourself that is built around avoiding discomfort. And that version feels real, because you have lived in it for so long, because you have repeated it so many times, because it has worked for you. It has helped you fit in. It has helped you avoid conflict. It has helped you feel accepted, at least on the surface. But there is a cost. And it is a cost that most people don't notice right away, because it doesn't show up as something obvious. It shows up as a feeling, a quiet one, a subtle one, a persistent one, a feeling that something is slightly off, that something doesn't fully align, that something is missing. And that feeling comes from a very specific place. It comes from the gap between who you are and who you have trained yourself to be. Because every time you adjust yourself to be accepted, you are making a trade. You are trading expression for safety. You are trading honesty for comfort. You are trading authenticity for belonging. And your brain sees that trade as worth it, because safety always comes first. But over time, those trades add up. And the gap gets bigger, and the bigger the gap becomes, the harder it is to ignore. Because even if people accept you, they are not accepting the real you. They are accepting the version you present. And somewhere inside you, you know that. Even if you can't explain it, even if you don't consciously think about it, you feel it. That's why validation never fully satisfies you. That's why approval doesn't feel complete. That's why even when everything looks fine, something still feels off. Because the part of you that wants to be seen is still hidden. And your brain is still doing its job. Still protecting you. Still adjusting you. Still trying to make sure you never feel that discomfort again. But here is the deeper truth. The protection that once helped you is now limiting you. The system that once kept you safe is now keeping you contained. Because your brain cannot tell the difference between past danger and present reality. It reacts to patterns, not truth. And if those patterns were built in moments where you felt unsafe being yourself, then your brain will continue to treat being yourself as something risky. Even when it is not. Even when you are in a room where people would accept you. Even when you are with people who actually want to know you. The pattern still runs, and that is why simply telling yourself to be more authentic does not work. Because you are not fighting a mindset. You are working against a system that was built to protect you. A system that has been reinforced over and over again for years. Which means change does not happen through force. It happens through awareness, through recognizing the pattern, through seeing it clearly in real time. Because the moment you see it is the moment you create a choice. And that choice is where everything begins to shift. But before you can change it, you have to understand something even deeper. The version of you that you show to the world is not random. It is not accidental. It is structured. It is consistent. It is patterned. And over time, it becomes something more than behavior. It becomes identity. And once it becomes identity, it no longer feels like something you can change. It feels like who you are. And that is where the next layer begins. Because the most powerful part of this entire process is not that you hide yourself. It is that you start believing the version you show is the real you. And once that happens, you are no longer just protecting yourself. You are living as someone else without even realizing it. And that is what we need to uncover next. Because the real question is no longer why your brain makes you hide. The real question is what happens when that hiding becomes who you think you are. Chapter 3. The version of you that slowly replaced the real one. At some point, something subtle begins to happen. It is not loud. It is not obvious. It does not feel like a major shift, but it changes everything. You stop noticing the difference between who you are and who you show. At first, the mask is something you use. You put it on in certain situations, around certain people, in certain environments. You are aware of it, even if only slightly. You know when you are holding back. You know when you are adjusting. You can still feel the gap. But over time, something changes. The mask stops being something you wear and starts becoming something you live in. It becomes automatic. You no longer think about what to say. You no longer question how to act. You no longer notice the adjustments. They just happen. And when something becomes automatic, it begins to feel real. This is where identity starts to shift. Because identity is not something fixed. It is something built. It is shaped by repetition. It is reinforced by behavior. It is defined by what you do over and over again. So when you repeatedly show a version of yourself that is filtered, adjusted, controlled, your brain begins to accept that version as who you are. Not as something you do, but as something you are. And that is where the line disappears. The line between the real you and the performed you. The line between truth and adaptation. And once that line disappears, you are no longer aware of the difference. You are no longer choosing the mask. You are living inside it. This is why so many people say things like, "This is just my personality. This is just how I am. I'm just a quiet person. I'm just an agreeable person. I'm just someone who avoids conflict." And sometimes those statements are true. But often they are not. Often they are descriptions of a version of you that was shaped by repeated adjustments. A version that learned what was safe to say what was safe to feel, what was safe to show, and then stayed within those boundaries because stepping outside of them feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels risky, even when it is not. So you stay inside the version that feels predictable, that feels controlled, that feels safe. But inside that safety, there is tension, because something inside you knows there is more. You feel it in small moments. Moments when you want to say something, but do not. Moments when you want to react honestly, but choose not to. Moments when you feel something strongly, but suppress it. And those moments create a split, a quiet, internal split, between what you experience and what you express, between what you feel and what you show, between who you are and who you present. And the longer that split exists, the more normal it becomes. You get used to it, you adapt to it, you learn how to live with it. But just because something feels normal does not mean it is natural. And this is where confusion starts to grow. Because if you have been living as a certain version of yourself for long enough, how do you know what is real anymore? How do you know which thoughts are yours and which ones were shaped by fear? How do you know which reactions are authentic and which ones are automatic? You do not. And that uncertainty creates something deeper, a quiet sense of disconnection, not just from other people, but from yourself. You begin to feel like you are not fully present in your own life, like you are watching yourself instead of being yourself, like you are managing how you appear instead of experiencing what is real. And this is where the cost becomes clearer, because when you are constantly managing yourself, you are never fully relaxed. You are always slightly aware, always slightly careful, always slightly controlled. Even in moments where you should feel free, even around people who would accept you, the pattern does not turn off. Because it is no longer a conscious behavior. It is identity. And when something becomes identity, it feels permanent. It feels unchangeable. It feels like this is just who you are. But it is not. It is who you became through repetition. Which means it can be changed. But before that happens, you have to see something clearly. The version of you that you have been living as is not random. It is structured. It follows patterns. It has rules, unspoken rules. Rules like do not say too much, do not be too different, do not risk discomfort, do not create tension. And you follow those rules without realizing it, because breaking them feels wrong. Not logically, emotionally. It feels uncomfortable. It feels unsafe. It feels like something might go wrong. And that feeling is what keeps the identity in place. Not logic, not reasoning, but emotion, because your brain is not trying to be accurate. It is trying to keep you within what feels safe, even if that safety comes at the cost of your authenticity. And that leads to something important. You're not just hiding from other people. You're hiding from the possibility of being fully seen. Because being fully seen comes with a risk. The risk of rejection, the risk of judgment, the risk of not being accepted. And your brain has learned that those risks should be avoided at all costs. So it keeps you within the version of yourself that feels acceptable. But here is the deeper truth. The more you live as that version, the further you move away from what is actually real. And the further you move away from what is real, the harder it becomes to feel anything fully. Because everything is filtered, everything is adjusted, everything is controlled. And that is why so many people feel something they cannot explain. A sense that something is missing, a sense that something is off, a sense that they are not fully connected to their own life. Because they are not, they are connected to the version of themselves that they have been maintaining, not the version that exists underneath it. And that is where the next realization begins. Because once you understand that the identity you are living in was built, then you have to face a harder question. If this version of you was constructed through small moments of adjustment, then what would happen if you stopped adjusting? And more importantly, what would people see if the version you have been presenting was no longer there? That question is uncomfortable. But it is also where the truth begins. Because the reality is this: you're not being rejected for who you are. You're being accepted for who you are not. And that changes everything. Chapter 4. The truth that changes everything. You're not being rejected for who you are. You're being accepted for who you are not. And if you really sit with that for a moment, it changes how you see everything. because most people live with a quiet assumption. They believe that when people like them, they are being liked for who they truly are. They believe that acceptance means connection. They believe that approval means they are being seen. But what if that is not true? What if the version of you that people respond to is not the real version of you? What if it is the version you have been presenting, the version that has been adjusted, filtered, controlled over time, the version that knows what to say, what not to say, how to act, how to avoid tension, the version that has learned how to be accepted? If that is the version people are responding to, then what exactly are they accepting? And more importantly, what are they not seeing? This is where the discomfort begins, because it forces you to look at something most people avoid: the gap between who you are and who you show. Because the larger that gap becomes, the more unstable your sense of connection becomes. On the surface, everything can look fine. People like you. Conversations go well. You fit in. You are included. But underneath all of that, there is a quiet tension, a feeling that something is incomplete, a feeling that something is missing, and that feeling does not come from a lack of approval. It comes from a lack of alignment, because you cannot feel fully accepted when the version of you that is being accepted is not fully real. And this is why approval often feels temporary. It feels good for a moment, but it does not last, because it is not landing on something solid. It is landing on a version of you that is constantly being maintained, constantly being adjusted, constantly being controlled, and anything that requires constant control cannot feel stable. Which means the more you rely on that version, the more fragile your sense of connection becomes. Because now, you're not just trying to connect, you're trying to maintain an image. You're trying to protect a version of yourself that feels acceptable, and that creates pressure. Subtle pressure. Constant pressure. The pressure to say the right thing, the pressure to react the right way, the pressure to not disrupt how people see you, and that pressure changes how you experience everything. You stop being present. You start monitoring. You start observing yourself while you're in the moment. You start thinking about how you are coming across instead of actually experiencing what is happening. And that creates distance. Distance between you and other people. But more importantly, distance between you and yourself. Because the more you monitor yourself, the less you are actually being yourself. And the less you are being yourself, the harder it becomes to feel anything fully. This is why even good interactions can leave you feeling empty. Not because they were bad, but because they were not real. Not fully, not completely. And somewhere inside you, you know that, even if you cannot explain it. Even if you do not consciously think about it, you feel it. That quiet sense that something is missing. That quiet sense that something is off. And most people respond to that feeling in the same way. They try harder. They try to be more likable, more interesting, more impressive. They refine the version of themselves even further. They make it smoother, more polished, more effective. And for a while that seems to work. They get more approval, more attention, more validation. But the feeling does not go away, because the problem was never a lack of approval. The problem was the absence of truth. And you cannot fix that by becoming better at performing. You can only fix that by becoming more real. But that is where the fear comes in. Because if the version you have been presenting is what people have accepted, then what happens if you stop presenting it? What happens if you stop adjusting? What happens if you show something that is less controlled, less filtered, less safe? Will people still respond the same way? Will they still accept you? Or will something change? That uncertainty is what keeps the pattern in place. Not logic, not evidence, but fear. Because your brain is still operating on the same assumption it learned early on. Being fully yourself is risky, and if something is risky, it should be avoided. So instead of taking that risk, you stay within what feels safe, even if that safety comes with a cost. And the cost is subtle, but it builds over time. You start to feel disconnected. You start to feel like something is missing. You start to feel like no matter how much approval you get, it is never enough. Because it is not reaching the part of you that actually wants to be seen. And that is the deeper truth. You are not just seeking approval. You are seeking recognition. You are seeking to be seen as you are, not as you present yourself to be. And until that happens, the feeling will remain. No matter how many people like you, no matter how well you fit in, no matter how successful you appear. Because the version of you that is being accepted is not the version of you that is looking for connection, and that creates a contradiction, a quiet but powerful contradiction. You are surrounded by people, but you do not feel fully known. You are accepted, but you do not feel fully understood. You are included, but you do not feel fully seen. And that is not because something is wrong with you. It is because something is missing. And what is missing is the real version of you in the interaction. Because connection is not built on performance. It is built on truth. And truth requires risk. It requires stepping outside of the version of yourself that you have learned to rely on. It requires showing something that is not perfectly controlled, not perfectly shaped, not perfectly safe. And that is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. Because without that, you will continue to experience the same pattern. Approval without satisfaction, connection without depth, presence without reality. And once you see that clearly, you cannot ignore it anymore. Because now you understand something most people do not. The issue is not that people do not like you. The issue is that they have not fully seen you. And that changes the question. The question is no longer, how do I get people to like me? The question becomes, what am I still hiding that is preventing real connection? And once that question appears, everything begins to shift. Because now the focus is no longer on performance, it is on truth. And truth always leads to the same place. A decision. A decision between staying within what feels safe or stepping into what is real. And that decision is where the real challenge begins. Chapter 5. Why you still feel empty, even when people like you. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The moment you realize that people are responding to a version of you that has been carefully shaped, something shifts, not loudly, but deeply. Because now, every interaction feels slightly different, not worse, just clearer. You begin to notice the pattern. You notice how you adjust your tone depending on who you are speaking to. You notice how certain thoughts never get expressed. You notice how quickly you filter yourself before you even realize it. And most importantly, you begin to notice the feeling that follows. That quiet feeling that lingers after conversations end. That subtle sense that something was missing. At first, it is easy to ignore, because on the surface, everything seems fine. People respond well to you. They engage. They laugh. They include you. From the outside, it looks like connection. But inside, it does not feel complete. It feels partial. It feels like something important never made it into the interaction. And that feeling is not random. It is not overthinking. It is not insecurity. It is feedback. It is your mind recognizing that what just happened was not fully real. Because connection is not just about interaction. It is about alignment. It is about the match between what you experience and what you express. And when those two things do not match, the experience feels incomplete. You can go through an entire conversation and still feel like you are not really there. Not because you were physically absent, but because a part of you never showed up. And that part is the part that actually wants to be seen. The part that is not filtered, or the part that is not adjusted. The part that is not trying to manage perception. And when that part stays hidden, the connection stays shallow, no matter how positive it looks. This is why approval often feels empty, because approval is being given to something that is not fully you. And somewhere inside you, you know that, even if you cannot explain it clearly. You feel it in the silence after the conversation ends. You feel it when you're alone again. You feel it when you reflect and realize that you held something back. And the more this happens, the more that feeling grows. Not dramatically, but consistently. It becomes a background feeling, a quiet sense of disconnection that follows you from interaction to interaction. And most people respond to that feeling in the same way. They try to fix it externally. They try to become more likable, more interesting, more impressive. They refine the version of themselves even further. They learn better communication. They learn social skills. They become more aware of how they are perceived. And in many ways, this works. They become better at navigating people, better at creating positive reactions, better at maintaining connections. But the feeling does not go away, because the problem was never a lack of skill. It was a lack of authenticity, and no amount of improvement can replace something that is missing. Because what is missing is not performance, it is presence. The presence of your real thoughts, the presence of your real reactions, the presence of your real perspective. And without that presence, everything feels slightly distant, slightly incomplete, slightly off. But over time, this creates a deeper conflict, because now there are two parts of you moving in different directions. One part of you wants connection, wants to be seen, wants to be understood, and the other part of you wants safety, wants control, wants to avoid discomfort. And those two parts do not always agree. The part that wants connection pushes you to be more open, to say what you really think, to express what you really feel, but the part that wants safety holds you back. It filters, it edits, it adjusts, and most of the time it wins, not because it is right, but because it feels safer, and safety to your brain always feels more important, even if it comes at a cost, and the cost, over time, becomes harder to ignore. You start to feel disconnected not just from other people, but from yourself. You start to question your own reactions. You start to wonder what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you would say if you were not filtering yourself. And sometimes you do not know. Because the filter has been there for so long, it feels natural. It feels automatic. It feels like you. And that is what makes this so difficult, because the thing that is causing the disconnection does not feel like a problem. It feels like identity. And when something feels like identity, you do not question it. You accept it. You adapt to it. You build your life around it. But the feeling does not go away, because the part of you that wants to be real is still there. It has not disappeared. It has not been replaced. It has just been quieted. And every time you ignore it, it becomes quieter. But it does not go away. It waits. It shows up in small moments. Moments where you feel a sudden urge to say something real. Moments where you feel a reaction that you do not express. Moments where you feel a disconnect that you cannot explain. And those moments are important, because they are signals. Signals that there is a gap between who you are and who you are showing. And that gap is what creates the emptiness. Not a lack of people, not a lack of connection, but a lack of truth within the connection. And once you recognize that the problem becomes clearer, you are not missing something externally. You are holding something back internally. And until that changes, the pattern will continue. No matter how many people you meet, no matter how many connections you build, no matter how much approval you receive. Because the feeling is not about others, it is about alignment. And alignment requires something that your brain has been trying to avoid. Risk. The risk of showing something real. The risk of not controlling the outcome. The risk of not knowing how people will respond. And that is where the next layer begins. Because if showing your true self comes with risk, then why does that risk feel so overwhelming? Why does something as simple as being honest feel so difficult? Why does something as natural as being yourself feel so uncomfortable? Chapter 6. Why letting go of the mask feels so scary. At this point, the pattern is clear. You see how the mask was created. You see how it became your identity. You see the cost of living inside it. And naturally, a thought begins to form. If this is not who I truly am, then why not just stop? Why not just be more real? Why not just say what you actually think and express what you actually feel? On the surface, it sounds simple, almost obvious. But when you try to do it, something inside you resists. Not logically, emotionally. You hesitate. You hold back. You feel a tension that is hard to explain. And that tension is not random. It is fear. Not loud fear. Not obvious fear. But a deep, quiet kind of fear that sits underneath your reactions. Because from your brain's perspective, removing the mask is not just a change. It is a risk. A real one. Because the mask has not just been protecting you from discomfort. It has been protecting you from rejection. And those are not the same thing. Discomfort is temporary. Rejection feels personal. It feels like something is wrong with you. It feels like you are not enough. And your brain has learned to avoid that feeling at all costs. So when you consider being more real, what your brain sees is not freedom. It sees exposure, it sees unpredictability, it sees the possibility that people might not respond the same way, that something might shift, that something might be lost, and even if that loss is not guaranteed, the possibility is enough. Because your brain is not trying to be accurate, it is trying to minimize risk, and from that perspective, staying the same feels safer, even if it comes with a cost. Because at least it is predictable, at least it is controlled, at least you know what to expect. And predictability feels like safety. This is why so many people stay in patterns they know are limiting. Not because they want to, but because the alternative feels uncertain. And uncertainty triggers fear, especially when that uncertainty involves how other people might respond to you. Because connection is important. Being accepted matters, and the idea of disrupting that feels like a threat. So instead of changing, you stay within what feels familiar, even if that familiarity is not fully aligned with who you are. And this is where something deeper needs to be understood. The mask is not just something you wear, it is something you depend on. It is a system you have built to navigate the world, and a system that tells you how to act, what to say, what to avoid, a system that helps you feel in control. And when you rely on a system for long enough, it starts to feel necessary, like you cannot function without it. Like removing it would leave you exposed, unprepared, vulnerable. That is what creates the resistance. Not laziness, not lack of awareness, but dependence. Because if the mask has been your way of staying safe, then removing it feels like removing your protection, even if that protection is no longer needed, and that is the paradox. The thing that once helped you is now holding you back. But because it helped you in the past, your brain still treats it as valuable, still treats it as necessary, still treats it as something that should not be removed. And that creates an internal conflict. So a part of you wants to be more real, to express yourself more honestly, to feel more connected. But another part of you resists. It pulls you back. It tells you to be careful, to not say too much, to not risk too much. And that part is not wrong. It is just outdated. It is operating on patterns that were built in a different context, in moments where being yourself did lead to discomfort, maybe even rejection. And your brain learned from those moments. It created rules that made sense at the time. But now those same rules are limiting you, because your environment is different, your awareness is different, your ability to handle discomfort is different, but your patterns have not caught up. They are still running automatically, still shaping your behavior without checking if they are still relevant. And that is why change feels difficult, because you are not just changing behavior, you are challenging a system that has been running for years, a system that was designed to protect you, and when you challenge a protective system, it reacts. It creates resistance. It creates doubt. It creates hesitation. Not because change is wrong, but because change is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels unsafe, even when it is not. This is why letting go of the mask is not just about deciding to be more authentic. It is about learning to tolerate the feeling that comes with it, the feeling of uncertainty, the feeling of exposure, the feeling of not knowing how people will respond. And that feeling is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. Because on the other side of that discomfort is something you have been missing. Real connection. Not controlled, not managed, not filtered, but real. The kind of connection where you do not have to think about how you are being perceived. The kind of connection where you can just exist, without adjusting, without performing, without holding back. But to get there, you have to pass through something first. You have to pass through the fear, not eliminate it, not avoid it, but move through it. Because fear does not disappear before action. It decreases after. And that is where the shift begins. Not when you feel ready, but when you start anyway. Even in small ways, because the goal is not to remove the mask all at once. That would feel overwhelming. That would trigger too much resistance. The goal is to loosen it, gradually, but moment by moment, until it no longer feels necessary. And that leads to the next step. Because once you understand the fear, the question becomes different. Not why am I afraid, but how do I move forward even when I feel it? Chapter 7. How to start becoming yourself again. Once you understand the pattern and you begin to see the fear behind it, something shifts. The problem is no longer invisible. You can recognize it. You can feel it in real time. You can notice the exact moment when you start to adjust, and that moment is where everything changes. Because for the first time you have something you did not have before. Choice. Not a big dramatic choice, not a life-changing decision. A small one, a quiet one. A moment where you can either follow the pattern or step slightly outside of it. And that is where this begins. Not by trying to become a completely different person, not by forcing yourself to be fully authentic all at once, but by noticing, by catching the moment when the pattern activates, the moment you feel the urge to filter yourself, the moment you feel the impulse to adjust your reaction, the moment you hesitate before saying what you really think. That moment is everything. Because if you miss it, the pattern runs automatically. But if you catch it, you create space. And inside that space, you can choose something different. At first, that choice will feel uncomfortable. It will feel unfamiliar. It will feel like you are doing something wrong. Not because it is wrong, but because it is new. Because you are stepping outside of something your brain has relied on for a long time. So the goal is not to eliminate that feeling. The goal is to tolerate it. To stay with it without immediately going back to what feels safe. And this is where most people struggle. Because they try to change too much at once. They try to suddenly become fully open, fully honest, fully themselves. And that creates too much resistance, too much discomfort, too much fear. So they stop, and the pattern stays the same. But there is another way, a much simpler way, a way that works with your brain instead of against it. And it starts small, very small. Instead of trying to be completely authentic, you become slightly more honest. Not everything, just something. A small reaction, a small opinion, a small truth. You say something that is a little closer to what you actually think. You express something that is a little less filtered. You allow a reaction that you would normally hold back. And you notice what happens. Not externally, internally. You notice the discomfort, you notice the tension, you notice the urge to correct yourself, to soften what you just said, to go back to what feels safe. Says, and instead of reacting to that urge, you stay with it. You let it be there without immediately changing your behavior. And something interesting happens. The feeling rises, then it stabilizes, then it fades. And in that moment, you learn something important. The discomfort you are trying to avoid is temporary. It does not last. It does not overwhelm you. It passes. And that realization is what begins to change the pattern. Because now, your brain starts to learn something new. Being real is uncomfortable, but it is not dangerous. And that is a completely different message from the one it learned before. But that message needs repetition. It needs experience. It needs proof, which means this process is not about one moment. It is about many moments. Small ones, consistent ones, the moments where you choose to be just slightly more real than you were before. And over time, those small shifts begin to add up. The gap between who you are and who you show starts to close. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but gradually. And as that gap closes, something else begins to change. Your sense of connection. Because now, when people respond to you, they are responding to something that is closer to what is real. And that feels different. It feels more stable, more grounded, more satisfying. Not because the interaction is perfect, but because it is aligned. And alignment creates a different kind of confidence. A quieter kind, a more stable kind. Because it is not based on performance. It is based on truth. And when your confidence is based on truth, you do not need to maintain it. You do not need to control how you are perceived. You do not need to constantly adjust, because you're not trying to protect an image. You are simply expressing what is real. And that simplicity is what makes it powerful. But this process requires something important: patience. Because you are not just changing behavior, you are rewiring a pattern that has been reinforced for years, and that takes time, not because you are slow, but because your brain learns through repetition, through consistent experience, through seeing the same result over and over again. So the goal is not perfection, it is consistency. It is choosing again and again to be slightly more real than the pattern expects you to be. And there will be moments where you fall back into old behavior. Moments where you filter yourself without realizing it. Moments where you choose safety over truth. And that is part of the process. Not a failure, not a setback. Just a continuation of the pattern you are learning to change. Because awareness is not about being perfect, it is about seeing clearly. And the more clearly you see, the easier it becomes to choose differently. And over time, those choices become natural. What once felt uncomfortable starts to feel normal. What once felt risky starts to feel manageable. What once felt impossible starts to feel simple. And that is when something deeper shifts. You stop trying to be yourself, and you start being yourself without effort. Because it is no longer something you are forcing. It is something you have returned to. And that is where the final transformation begins. Because once you no longer rely on the mask, the question is no longer, how do I be more real? The question becomes, who are you when you no longer need to hide? Chapter 8. Becoming someone who no longer needs a mask. At some point, something quiet begins to change. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that other people immediately notice, but in a way that you feel subtle at first, then clearer, then undeniable. You stop trying so hard, not because you do not care, but because you no longer feel the need to control every interaction. You no longer feel the constant pressure to say the right thing, to act the right way, to manage how you are being perceived. That pressure begins to fade. And in its place, something else appears. Calm. Not the absence of thought, not the absence of awareness, but the absence of tension. The absence of that constant internal monitoring that used to run in the background of everything you did. Because when you are no longer performing, there is nothing to maintain. There is no version of yourself that needs to be protected. There is no image that needs to be carefully managed. There is only what is real in that moment. And that changes how you experience everything. Conversations feel different, not because you are saying something extraordinary, but because you are not filtering as much. You are not holding yourself back in the same way. You are present, fully present, not split between what you feel and what you show, not divided between what you think and what you say. And that presence creates something powerful. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but a quiet certainty, a certainty that does not depend on how other people respond. Because for the first time, your experience of yourself is not being shaped by external reactions. It is coming from within. And that changes the way you relate to people. You stop trying to impress. You stop trying to be liked. You stop trying to control the outcome of every interaction. And paradoxically, that is what makes you more natural to be around. Because there is no tension, no effort, no sense that you are trying to be something. You are simply being. And people feel that. Even if they cannot explain it, they feel the difference between someone who is performing and someone who is not. Because performance always carries a certain pressure, a certain need, a certain subtle tension. But authenticity feels different. It feels grounded. It feels stable. It feels real. And that is what creates genuine connection. Not perfection, not saying the right thing, not being impressive. But being real enough that the other person does not feel like they have to perform either. And that is where connection deepens. Because when one person stops performing, it creates space. Space for honesty. Space for openness. Space for something real to exist. And that is something most people are not used to. Because most people are still living behind their own masks. Still adjusting. Still filtering. Still managing how they are perceived. So when they encounter someone who is not doing that, it stands out. Not in an obvious way, but in a felt way. In a way that makes them feel slightly more at ease, slightly more relaxed, slightly more themselves. And that is what real presence does. It does not demand attention. It creates comfort. But this transformation is not just about how others experience you. It is about how you experience yourself. Because when you are no longer constantly adjusting something inside, you settles. You no longer feel that subtle sense of disconnection. You no longer feel like you are holding something back in every interaction. You no longer feel like something is missing. Because what was missing was you. And now you are there. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel aligned. Enough to feel present. Enough to feel real. And that alignment changes how you move through the world. You make decisions differently. Not based on what will be accepted, but based on what feels true. You express yourself differently. Not based on what sounds right, but based on what actually reflects your thinking. You respond differently. Not based on what avoids discomfort, but based on what feels honest. And that creates a different kind of life. A life that is not built around maintaining an image, but around expressing something real. And that does not mean everything becomes easy. It does not mean you never feel discomfort. It does not mean you never hesitate. But the relationship with those feelings changes. You no longer see discomfort as something to avoid. You see it as part of being real. You no longer see uncertainty as something dangerous. You see it as part of being honest. And that shift is what removes the need for the mask. Because the mask was never the goal. It was the solution. A solution to a problem that no longer needs to be solved. And once you realize that, you stop relying on it. Not by force, not by effort, but by understanding. Because when something is no longer necessary, you do not have to fight it. You simply stop using it. That is what this becomes. Not a battle, not a struggle, but a gradual return. A return to something that was always there. Something that was never lost, only covered, only adjusted, only shaped by experience. And now uncovered again. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to feel the difference. Enough to move forward differently. Enough to know that you are no longer living as a version of yourself that was built around fear. And that is where the real freedom begins. Not in becoming someone new, but in no longer needing to be someone else. Because at the end of all of this, that is what changes everything. You stop asking, how do I become more? And you start realizing you never needed to. You were already enough. You just learn to hide it, and once you stop hiding, everything changes. At the beginning of this video, we talked about something small, a moment you probably don't even remember, a moment where you adjusted, where you held something back, where you became just a little more acceptable. And from that moment, a pattern began, a pattern that shaped how you speak, how you act, how you present yourself to the world. Not because you were trying to be fake, but because you were trying to feel safe. And over time, that pattern became something more. It became identity. It became the version of you that people know, the version that learned how to fit in, how to avoid rejection, how to be accepted. But as you've seen throughout this video, that version came with a cost. A quiet one, a subtle one, but a real one. It's on the cost of feeling disconnected, the cost of holding something back, the cost of not being fully seen. Because the truth is simple. You cannot feel truly accepted if you are not truly expressed. And that's why, even when everything looks fine on the outside, something inside you can still feel off. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something real has been missing from the way you show up. You, not the adjusted version, not the filtered version, not the version that knows exactly what to say, but the real version, the one that doesn't need to perform, the one that doesn't need to be managed, the one that simply exists without constantly trying to be accepted. And the shift you've been building toward throughout this entire video is not about becoming someone new. It's about returning. It's returning to something that was always there. Something that was never lost, only shaped by experience. Only covered by patterns that once helped you but no longer serve you in the same way. Because the mask you wear today was never a mistake. It was a solution. A solution your mind created to protect you, to help you belong, to help you navigate a world where being fully yourself didn't always feel safe. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what once protected you can also limit you if you never move beyond it. And that's the moment you're in right now. A moment of awareness, a moment where you can see the pattern, where you can recognize the difference between who you are and who you've been showing. And once you see that difference, you have something powerful. Choice. Not a big, overwhelming change. Not a complete transformation overnight. Just small moments. Moments where you choose to be slightly more real, slightly more honest, slightly less filtered. And those moments matter more than you think, because that is how everything began, in small moments. And that is how everything changes, the same way. So you don't need to force anything. You don't need to suddenly become a completely different person. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to notice. Notice when you adjust. Notice when you hold back. Notice when you are about to choose safety over truth. And in that moment, give yourself a different option, even if it's small, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it feels unfamiliar. Because that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something is real. And the more you allow that, the more natural it becomes. The more aligned you feel, the more present you become in your own life. And over time, you stop trying to be yourself, and you simply are. And when that happens, something shifts. Not just in how others see you, but in how you experience everything. Connection feels deeper. Conversations feel real. Your sense of self feels stable. Not because everything is perfect, but because it is honest. And that honesty is what changes everything. So as you leave this video, don't ask yourself, how do I become someone new? Ask yourself something simpler. Where am I still hiding? And what would happen if I stopped? Start there.